Hi, and welcome to the show. Subscribe at kevinmd.com/podcast. Today, we welcome back Jessie Mahoney, pediatrician and certified coach. Today's Kevin MD article is Why Judgment is Hurting Doctors and How Mindfulness Can Heal. Jessie, welcome back to the show.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right. What's this latest article about?
Well, it's about judgment, and it's really inspired because so many people who work in medicine, we have so much judgment about ourselves, and we don't notice the sort of judgment culture in medicine that we were raised in. And what I see all the time is how much harm it causes to physicians, but also to patients, and also just sort of the whole culture of medicine. And it strikes me as such an important thing to think about now because there's so much we can't do anything about in medicine and in our society. And yet there are things that we can do something about. And this is one of them.
So, when you say that physicians face that judgment culture in medicine, what are some examples of what that could look like and who are judging us?
Well, interestingly, number one, we judge ourselves, and that's probably the most harsh approach. And we cloak it in this sort of like, well, this is what it takes to do better. But it's like, why did you do that? What's wrong with you? How could you not know? And so there's that piece, which is sort of the hidden judgment. And then we also tend to judge our colleagues, the person in the office next to us. We always look at, the care other people provide, and whether it's to decide like, oh, well, I would never have done that, or to decide why did they do that? They shouldn't have done that. And we cloak that in really improvement, if that makes
Mhm.
sense. And if you think about M&M, we also have just tons of judgment. It's not so much like, how do we improve care or what can we learn from this? It's this blame shame culture that we have, which is like something went wrong, it's somebody's fault. Instead of thinking about, oh, well, human bodies are complicated, medicine is complicated. What could we learn? How could we do better? It's much more of a where did the mistake happen? Who's responsible? And we know sort of from neuroscience that this doesn't help you learn, it doesn't help us change, and it leads to a lot of burnout and oftentimes even worse things like suicide, people feeling like they made a mistake. And so I think just honoring that we have this culture and it was taught along the way, but that we can change it. And then the other piece that is also pretty disturbing is the language that we use in medicine. We also tend to judge patients, and it's not done maliciously. It's just sort of the language that we were trained to use, like complaining and denying. And, many of the diagnostic criteria use the words incompetent or failure or things like that. And so it's just steeped in the culture in these very hidden ways that really does change the energy. None of those words, and judgment is not particularly a healing energy,
Yeah.
which is what we're in medicine to do.
And sometimes that culture of judgment leads to the opaqueness and a lack of transparency that we in medicine are often accused of, right?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think when people feel judged, it's the human tendency to go into shame and to sort of go inside and hide. It doesn't lead to open conversations and solutions to complex problems, which health and medicine are all complex problems, whether they're systemic or physiologic.
And for those who aren't immersed in our world of medicine, how did it get to be this way?
Well, I think it got to be this way. I mean, the answer is I don't know. It's been this way since I came into medicine 30 years ago. But I think that it's really steeped in this idea of actually providing good care and doing better and using this sort of judgment as a way of ensuring competence, or it was really sort of equated with caring. If you would judge yourself harshly and have this hypervigilance. And I am in pediatrics, which is many people think we're the nicest and the least judgy, and yet we're not. We in fact judge each other more harshly because it's for the children. And that's really the culture, I think, in medicine is this is a caring, serving, outwardly focused profession. And so therefore we must judge one another inside to make sure we're performing at the highest level. But we actually know that we don't perform at the highest level if we are judging, right? Because we're releasing cortisol and norepinephrine. Your brain doesn't learn in that way. So if we really want to learn from what I like to call undesired outcomes, because they're never, we call them bad outcomes or And I think if we want to learn from that, judgment is not the way to learn. We know that from neuroscience. And so, could we be curious, or could we actually show up with kindness and compassion, recognizing that the work we do is hard and it's complex and patients don't read the book,
Yeah.
diseases don't actually read the textbook. And so I think it came from what I would see as a good place. I don't think it's malicious, but I think if we don't call it out and change it, when we see it and when we know it, that we're missing a real opportunity to help medicine heal and help patients heal.
So, as you mentioned, you're a pediatrician. So, that culture of judgment, how does it affect your day-to-day practice, whether it's in a clinic or in the hospital?
Well, one, it's the judgment of self. Like, did I miss something?
Okay.
And might I miss something? And this idea of really not having your own back. Like, our default thought pattern in pediatrics is not like, I did the best I could. I went through all the options. It's when something happens, it's what did I miss?
Hmm.
What did I do wrong? And I mean, if I'm being so honest, when something happens, we go back to the chart and we hope, oh, I hope it's not me. I hope it was someone else that made the mistake. That's sort of how the judgment shows up. And I think also we tend to, look at our colleagues' care once we haven't figured it out, said like, well, what did they miss? That's really the thought. Or what did I miss? Rather than,
Hmm.
how can we be curious? I wonder what's going on here. Why is it, not why, what can we learn? Where is there a clue? What if, outside of medicine, we think of failure or not getting it right the first time as a learning opportunity. I have a son who works in a startup. It's just learning.
Yeah.
But in medicine, it's judgment and what's wrong with you. And so I think that, even in peds, we look at our colleagues and we're saying, well, how could this have happened? And even as end systems as well.
Yeah.
And I think we even judge often our staff and our support staff. It's like they didn't get this right. Instead of how can we help them learn? How can we grow? And interestingly, in peds, when we look at kids who are developing, we don't say how come they didn't learn to walk yet,
Yeah.
right? It's like how can we help them? What support do they need? And if you're thinking about training, I think it's the same thing. We tend to, as attendings or as faculty, I coach people a lot about, well, how do I give this negative feedback or help this problem resident? Instead of, how can we foster their development or their growth? Or thinking about, in leadership, we have performance improvement
Yeah.
plans. But
Yeah.
what if we were investing in our doctors? Or we need doctors. We have such a shortage, right? So how can we invest in people and recognize that the work is hard? I don't know a person who goes into medicine who isn't good-hearted and wanting to change the world, because there's so much else you could do that would be so much easier,
Sure.
right? And so but instead we judge.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
I think many people leave because of that energy, which just doesn't feel good. You're trying your hardest and yet you're constantly being judged.
So let's talk about some paths forward. In your article, you talk about the concept. Is it pronounced Maitri, unconditional friendliness? Is that
It's called Maitri.
Maitri? Maitri. So tell
Maitri.
us what that is.
Well, it's really this idea of kindness and compassion is how I like to think of it. But I love it because it's this kindness to yourself and compassion to yourself, assuming good intent. In mindfulness, we would call it generosity. And in other cultures, they call it Maitri. And I really like this idea of being kind to yourself, kind to those you work with, kind to the patients that you care for, kindness for society and all of the people suffering and struggling. And so it's this, rather than judgment and rather than pointing fingers and looking at what's wrong, it's like, how can we do better? What can we learn from it? So, but it includes yourself, which I think is one of the key pieces. In yoga, we call it ahimsa, which is do no harm, but it's do no harm to yourself.
Mhm.
And so it's showing up with this loving, caring intent, which I think we cloak judgment in medicine, but Maitri doesn't actually include that.
So what would that look like when you are doing your coaching sessions with a physician? How do you break that loop of self-judgment? What are some things that those physicians listening to us today, what can they do?
Well, the first part is to notice where you're being judgy. And I'll often ask people to like take a week and just notice how often you're judging yourself. And it's usually hundreds of times a day that you criticize yourself or say something negative, cloaked in, I'm improving, I'm doing
Yeah.
better. But noticing again, I think if you go back to kids learning to walk, they don't get mad at themselves. They just get up and try again. They assume they're doing their best. And so I think number one is noticing. And then number two is really that self-compassion. And that's common humanity. We're all here trying to be good humans in the world. And maybe not every human, but Maitri would say every human has goodness in them and is trying to do their best in the world. And then being intentional about how you want to move forward. Judgment, for example, is very draining. And so, can you recognize how it impacts you and decide how you want to move forward? I often say, it's very hard to get from being mean to yourself or judgment to self-compassion. But can you be neutral? Can you just not judge or opt out? Can you be curious? I wonder what I can learn from this, or how interesting that this happened. And then I think also recognizing this generosity, which is assuming good intent, telling a neutral story or not telling a bad story about what happened. So I don't know why this happened, could be sort of a neutral story. And I think often same thing with I wonder what my colleague was thinking. And so it's asking what I would call helpful questions rather than harmful questions.
Yeah.
And I think when we can stay in curiosity and compassion and out of this sort of depletion and reaction, we can actually choose to move forward differently. I love this idea of an intention, which I think is something we really don't use in medicine because it's choosing how you want to show up.
Mm-hmm.
So you might say, I'm going to choose to be curious when I see that my patient showed up in the ER. That for me was always, I immediately would go to the chart and say, I wonder what happened. What did I miss? When did I last see them? And so it's like, can I be curious about what happened in a non-judgmental way? And I think when you choose something with intention, that's what your brain focuses on. If our brain doesn't have anything to focus on, it goes to the negative, which is judgment. And so simply by setting that sort of GPS in that direction, you can keep yourself out of that negativity. But again, if you don't even notice it, which most of us don't, we're so acculturated to it, we just think it's normal that we don't make change. I think another thing too is to think about your dot phrases. And if you have control over what they say, maybe take out the words complain, deny,
Sure.
state, against, things like that where you can. Obviously, the ICD-9 or the diagnosis codes, you've got to use whatever's there. But where you have control, can you change things there just to change the energy by which you move through your day in medicine?
So I'm sure that you know that the current culture of medicine, where there's a focus on performance,
Mhm.
metrics, patient satisfaction scores, right? That's the epitome of judgment.
Yes.
Now, how can you reconcile that tension between breaking self-judgment against the environment that we're currently in? How can physicians navigate that?
Number one, I'll just honor that it's tricky, right? Because that is actually not really about care. It's about money. It's about business. It's about other things. So part of it for me was really recognizing that a lot of those metrics they weren't a judgment of my doctoring. They weren't a judgment of my caring. They weren't a judgment of how I was taking care of patients. They were simply being measured for other business metrics. And so if you cannot over personalize it, that can be helpful. And I think when you're grounded in, I'm doing the right thing for my patients, which is a constant reminder, right? Because you're being told things outside. My hope is that things will ultimately change, but they're not going to change if we stay steeped in judgment of ourselves and one another. And so part of us is recognizing what of those metrics are about good care, good health care, and what are actually metrics. Someone's trying to measure something to compare insurance plans, for example. And I like to think about peer review and M&M, which are also kind of fit in that category. Those are really more about malpractice and healthcare systems than about your care. And so recognizing if you can go into it as a what can we learn from this? And I've actually worked with quite a few physicians who lead those programs in coaching. And I think when they shift their framing of those sessions, then people want to come, then the conversations open up and we can actually learn more. This is a bit of like the physicians taking back what's right and helpful for patients from these bigger, overarching higher systems. And
Mhm.
absolutely, it's not easy, but we have to start somewhere. And if we can start at least from within and recognizing that those metrics are not necessarily about us. Now, I fully acknowledge that often our raises and bonuses and pay and all these things come from that. But resisting the reality of that also isn't going to help us. And so, sort of, it really has to come from within and from caring for each other.
We're talking to Jessie Mahoney, pediatrician and certified coach. Today's Kevin MD article is Why Judgment is Hurting Doctors and How Mindfulness Can Heal. Jessie, as always, let's end with some take-home messages that you want to leave with the Kevin MD audience.
I think the biggest take-home message is that if we aren't aware of the judgment and we don't notice it, pay attention to it, and decide to show up differently, then really we're contributing to some of these challenges. And so while there's so much out of our control, there is this piece is in our control. We get to choose how we show up, how we treat ourselves, how we treat our colleagues, and the language that we bring to teaching the next generation of physicians, caring for each other as leaders, and that is in our control.
Jessie, as always, thank you so much for sharing your perspective and insight, and thanks again for coming back on the show.
You are welcome. Thank you for having me.